So, dear learners, we have with us Professor Shubhangi Vaidya from IGNOU. So, we will continue our session. Okay, welcome you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rita, and let us begin our session now. Basically, the theme of the particular block that we're dealing with, which is block number 4, is developmental pathways, social justice, equity, and equality. And in today's session, we shall be talking about the idea or the principles of equity and social justice. Now, social justice is a very, very important idea in all developmental thinking, basically because it pertains to our ideas of what really would constitute a just, a fair, a kind of a social order or a kind of a society where each and every individual gets his or her due. Now, this particular concept is even more important in relation to the idea of sustainability, because sustainability, as you know, and as you have studied, and as several of your teachers have discussed with you, basically refers to a pattern of development which does not compromise on the quality of life of people, which does not compromise with the integrity of the environment, and which is basically a pattern of development that moves away from the growth oriented or the economic growth oriented pattern, which is based upon extraction of resources, which is based upon a pattern of development in which some people develop but other people are left behind. So therefore, social justice ties in very, very importantly with the idea of sustainability. And there are certain concepts about this entire topic which we can discuss so that we get a better idea of what we mean by social justice, what we mean by equality, what we mean by equity. In subsequent lectures, we'll be talking about the very, very important issue of human rights also. So to begin with, let's ask the question, what do we mean by equality and equity? Although these concepts sound very similar, there is a difference between them. Now, environment, development, and sustainability are closely linked with equity and social justice, as I've just mentioned. However, equity and social justice are not the same. So while equality means everybody is the same and must be treated in the same fashion, equity takes into account existing discriminations and equalities so that people are treated fairly. What do we mean by this? Let's take a simple example. If we say that equity and equality should be the same, suppose we say that everybody is equal, then perhaps two children in a classroom would be treated absolutely in the same way without any regard for their specific qualities or without any regard for their specific vulnerabilities. However, suppose there is a child who comes from a socio-economically deprived background. Suppose there is a girl child who faces a lot of gender discrimination. In that case, would we treat these two children in the identical fashion? The answer obviously is not. Because when we talk about equity, we have to take into context or we have to take on board the fact that people's life circumstances are not the same. That there are people who face certain discriminations and there are certain people who have more privileges as compared to other people. So this is why it is very important to distinguish this concept of equity and equality and be very clear that these are not the same thing, right? So equity implies fairness and justice without any biasness. Sorry, the slide seems to have moved ahead. Without any bias or discrimination. And equity derives from the concept of social justice. It represents a belief that there are some things which people should have, that there are basic needs that should be fulfilled, that burdens and rewards should not be spread too divergently across the community, and that policy should be directed with impartiality, fairness, and justice towards these ends. This is a quotation from Falk and others, 1993. Now, just let's look at this idea. So, equity derives from the concept of social justice. I've already explained this to you. And also, it represents a belief that there are some things which people should have. So, for example, we are all in agreement that everybody should have the certain basic needs like nutrition, education, the right to health care, the right to justice, and that across the community, the burdens and rewards, in other words, the rights and privileges, should not be spread too much. In other words, that it should not be a situation where some people have access to everything and other people have access to very little. So basically, when we talk about social justice, we refer to distributive justice. And any kind of policy making should have to factor this point in very, very carefully. So any policy should take into account that there are people, that all people need the same things. And there are people who will have access to these things more easily. There are people who will have greater difficulty in accessing these goods, these common societal goods, and therefore policy has to be tailored in this direction. So equity means giving people what rightfully belongs to them and recognizing the specific as well as the diverse conditions of each individual. Now let's talk about another very important concept when we talk about equity: intra-generational equity and intergenerational equity. What do we mean by these concepts? Now, when we talk about intra-generational equity, so intra means within a generation. It means equitable access of resources within the current generation, where one generation is responsible for meeting the needs and passing it on to the next generation. So, when we talk about intra-generational equity, we refer to issues like inequalities in wealth, access to resources, exposure to environmental hazards, pollution, etc. We also refer to gaps between the rural and the urban, developed and developing nations. Also, for instance, gender equity, or the lack of gender equity that we see all around us. And intergenerational equity implies that resources should be distributed in such a way that the future generations receive the same natural and cultural resources that are enjoyed by the present generation. Sharon Beeder mentioned a very, very important concept when we're talking about sustainability: the notion of weak sustainability and strong sustainability. In other words, here she's referring to the impact of the present generation's activities on the environment, which is inherited by the future generation. So we can talk about a couple of things in this context. For instance, when we look at globalization, globalization is something that is a universal feature, has been a movement or has been a process that has been undergone or that has been undergoing for the last several decades. So, what does globalization mean? Globalization basically refers to the way in which the economy, the society, the culture of the world is now coming more and more close together. In other words, it refers to the way in which global systems, including the economic system, including the socio-cultural system, including the political system, are tied more and more or more and more interconnected. Globalization also involves the easy flow of materials, of people from one part of the globe to another. So this would involve migration, this would involve investment, from one country to the other. This would involve a great deal of interconnected activities. And we see that globalization has definitely led to a loss of biodiversity. For instance, in order to supply the needs of a growing globalized economy, we find that the natural resources of various places have been depleted or have come under stress or have come under conflict. Similarly, when we look at the impact of climate change and global warming, we will find that the impacts of climate change are actually fall in a very unequal way on different communities and on different categories of people. So there are certain countries, for instance, whose carbon footprint may not be large, but who, in a sense, bear the brunt of climate change because of the developmental activities of other larger countries. We also find that certain communities, when climate change takes place, we find many related processes like desertification. We find that changes in global temperature lead to crop failure, lead to natural disasters, and lead to, therefore, communities being completely deprived or bereft of their livelihoods and of their natural habitat. And who are these communities who suffer the most? These are the communities who are poor. These are the communities who are marginalized. These would include women and children. These are the greatest sufferers of the impacts of climate change and global warming. And also, very importantly, the impact of nuclear products and nuclear waste, which are born or which are tolerated in a very, very unequal way by different communities all over the world. So basically, what we are trying to drive at, or what we are trying to express, is that the costs of globalization is very, very unequally borne by different categories of people. And it is the marginalized communities, it is the communities who are weaker, that tend to bear the brunt or tend to bear the price for development. And when we speak about sustainability, this is a very, very important factor to be kept in mind. Let's talk about equity at the international level. As we see, and what I have been indicating so far in this talk, the gap between the developing and the developed nations, the inequality and inequity in resource consumption and management. Let's look at a simple example. We are talking about, we are living in a time of pandemic. Look at the kind of vaccine inequality, for example, that is existing on the global framework. We find that while some developed nations are talking about the third vaccine or booster vaccine, there are millions and, in fact, billions of people in this world who have not even received their first COVID-19 vaccine. So there is a great deal of inequality in resource consumption and management. There is a great deal of inequality in the way different communities have access to the basic fundamental goods that every human being should have access to. Another example is, for instance, the dumping of hazardous wastes. Poor countries or poorer countries become the dumping grounds of the richer ones. And all of you have discussed this in detail, or you've studied this in detail in your program, and this has been discussed in other lectures, I'm sure, so I will not devote too much time to it. And as I had mentioned earlier, the impact of climate change, which is caused by the activities of developed countries and which is felt much more acutely by the poor and the lesser developed ones. So, strategies to reduce inequity should be made based upon a fair distribution of resources and of consumption. So, this is the key takeaway, that when we think of policy or when we think of strategies, we have to take into consideration that there are inbuilt structural inequalities in the world which need to be factored in, which need to be taken into account. Let's talk now about environmental justice, equity, and sustainability. We've spoken so far about the notion of social justice, about the notion of equity, about how there are so many built-in inequalities, so many structural inequalities in the world, which can be seen or which manifest in so many different ways. How is environmental justice, or how is the notion of the environment and sustainability interrelated with these notions of social justice? So, as is very obvious, human society cannot remain in harmony when the environment is disturbed and there is a lack of distributed justice. This is very, very clear. And I think if we look at the pattern of global development over the past 50 years or so, if we see the way in which extractive processes, the way the environment has been extracted, the way there has been a kind of hegemony of global powers over the poorer countries. For instance, if you look at history itself, you see that the entire enterprise of colonialism was built upon this notion of developed Western powers extracting the natural resources from the poorer countries and thereby completely disturbing their ecosystem, completely disturbing their natural, completely disturbing the habitats, completely disturbing the livelihoods of the indigenous people. So we see that environmental justice is an issue of equity and social justice. So what do we mean by environmental justice? It is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental policies. In this context, we can also speak about outcome equity and process equity. Outcome equity refers to the equitable distribution of environmental hazards or environmental amenities, whereas process equity entails an equitable procedure for deciding both where to site these environmental hazards or amenities and on production of the burdens that require distribution. So, in other words, what we are trying to say is that environmental justice or environmental equity ensures that the burden of environmental hazards are not unequally borne by a certain community or a certain nation, but the way in which these hazards, or for that matter, the benefits that result from development, are equitably distributed. And this involves a very, very fundamental procedure or a very, very fundamental process of deciding where to site these hazards and on, as we've mentioned, the production of the burdens that require distribution. To quote Monica Ramirez Andreotta in Environmental and Pollution Science, 3rd edition, 2019, and I quote, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. It demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias. It mandates the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land and renewable resources in the interest of a sustainable planet for humans and other living things. And it affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self determination of all peoples. So I think here a very, very important point is ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land and renewable resources. In other words, the way in which we use resources should have sustainability at the very heart of the discussion. So, this very, very important way of looking at the planet, rather than looking at the planet as being a place where we can just exploit resources. However, looking at it in terms of the view that it is a place where not just human beings, but all species have equal rights, that all species are interdependent, and that only ecological unity of all species can result in saving the planet in the end and saving it from ecological destruction. With these fundamental values or these fundamental ethical principles in mind, can we then really speak of environmental justice? And when we speak of environmental justice, when we try to move towards environmental justice, automatically we also affirm social justice, because environmental justice also means political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination of all peoples. Let's now talk about some very important environmental movements that have sought or that have really played an important role in trying to achieve social justice and equity. Now, actually, when we speak about environmental movements in the Indian context, we find that all environmental movements actually derive or actually are deeply connected with the notion of social justice. So, why is it, unlike the West? I mean, you can see this basic difference in environmental movements of the West and the East and of developing countries, that our or the developing countries, for them, environment is very much a part and parcel of the whole notion of social justice. So, one of the most important movements or one of the most important andolans that that has become a kind of a global case study is that of Chipko. Is there some disturbance?
Ma'am, slides are not moving.
Where? Oh, I see. So which slide are we at?
Slide number 3.
Oh, I see. Can you turn off the recording for a minute? We'll just